Last week, we began looking at the 7 earmarks of a man of faith as he is exampled for us in Hebrews chapter 11. And so if you turn in your Bibles to the 11th chapter of Hebrews, we'll pick up where we left off last week. We looked at the first 5 of these examples in our text where we said a man of faith is, and here they are, somebody who's moved by his faith, walks in obedience, accepts his or her own humanity, has an eternal focus. And then lastly, we covered it's one who grows in their faith. And we'll cover the last 2 this morning. But before we start breaking it down, let's go ahead and turn and read the text along with me, okay? Hebrews chapter 11, verse 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departures of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he had become of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the approach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. And by faith the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, for she had received the spies with peace. And what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, and also of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, attained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, became valiant in battle, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead back to life. Others were tortured and not accepting a deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Still others had trials of mockings and scourgings, and yes, of chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. And all these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. Now, we need to understand, I think, before we can ever grasp, get a good hold on Hebrews chapter 11, we need to understand that these guys were just regular dudes and dudettes. I mean, they were just regular, ordinary people, just like you and me. They had their good days and they had their bad days. There were times when they represented the Lord well, and there were times when it was not so much. For example, there was this old geezer who had become bored with his retired life, and so he decided to open up a medical clinic. He put up a sign outside that said, all treatments $500. And then he put another sign that said, if not cured, you get $1,000 back. 200% return. Well, Scott was positive that this old geezer didn't know beans about medicine. And so he thought this would be a great opportunity to get $1,000. He went to Dr. Geezer's clinic and thought he would use the alias of Mr. Young. Dr. Geezer, Scott said, I have lost all taste in my mouth. Can you please help me? Well, nurse, he said, bring medicine from box 22 and put 3 drops on Mr. Young's mouth. Ah, exclaimed Scott, that's gasoline. Congratulations, responded Dr. Geezer. You have your taste back. That'll be $500. Well, Scott gets annoyed and he leaves. And after a couple of days of fuming about it, he decided that he'd recover his money, and so he goes back. And he says, Dr. Geezer, I have lost all my memory. I can't remember a single thing. So without a moment's hesitation, Dr. Geezer said, Nurse, get the medicine in box 22 and put 3 drops on the patient's tongue. Oh, no, you don't. That's gasoline, Scott retorted quickly. Oh, good, you got your memory back. That'll be $500. Well, Scott, now having lost $1,000, feeling very defeated, left the clinic. That night, he was sharing his woes with his friend Colton. You just can't quit like that, Colton said. You just got to get your money back. Nah, I'm through, responded the downtrodden Scott. Well, Colton said, listen, I'll take care of it, just you wait and see. So the next day, Colton goes into Dr. Geezer's clinic posing as Scott's younger brother. My eyesight has become so weak, Dr. Geezer, I can't hardly see. Well, said the old man in the lab coat, I don't have any money for that, or any medicine for that, so here's your money back. And he hands him a handful of bills. Well, Mr. Young, Jr., looking at the bills Dr. Geezer just placed in his hand, said, but this is only $500. Congratulations, you got your vision back, replied Dr. Geezer. That'll be $500. So the moral of the story, just because you're young doesn't mean you can outsmart an old geezer. Like I said, these guys were just ordinary dudes. If anything else, the guys in our text this morning they were human. In fact, I would maybe ask us to, passage has often been known as the Hebrews Hall of Faith. And I would want us to know if this legitimately falls into that category. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. Verse 22, by faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the destruction of the children of Israel and gave instruction, or the departure of the children of Israel, and gave instructions concerning his bones. And by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw that he was a beautiful child, and they weren't afraid of the king's command. So Isaac gave birth to Jacob and Esau. And there was the whole thing between the two sons, how they fought over their inheritance, and then Jacob gave birth to the 12 sons, and Joseph was sold into slavery. And when he raised up to be essentially the number 2 guy in the world, he said when the family was joined back to him in Egypt, he says, by the way, there's going to be a day when we go back to that land of promise. And when we do, take my bones with you. I don't want to. I'll have enough of Egypt by then. And right before that departure happened, when the children of Israel left Egypt, Moses was born. And it says that his parents didn't follow the king's command, which was to throw all male babies into the river. They didn't follow his command because they saw that Moses was a beautiful child. Well, of course they did. You know, he was their baby. He was their bambino. He was. What parent doesn't think their kid is the most beautiful one? Truth is, they're not. But every parent thinks they are. In fact, the New American Standard also uses the phrase "beautiful child" to describe him. The word literally means city-born. Or of polished manners or elegant. It's referring to somebody like a city slicker, somebody that never had dirt under their fingernails, somebody that had it easy all of their life. The NIV says he was no ordinary child. The New King James says he was a proper child. What the saying is that the parents looked at the baby Moses while he was laying there in the manger, and they said, "Kid's got panache. He's going someplace. He's going to be somebody." And so we know the story. What the author is telling us here is that God used the natural familial love of the parents to shape destiny. in a way to shape the destiny of the entire world. But Amram and Jochebed, Moses' mom and dad, they acted by faith. That's the point. Walking by faith doesn't always mean walking on water. It doesn't always mean having some sort of a miracle. What it means is doing right with what God gives you. When we trust God, which is what walking by faith means, when we trust God, that means that we get what God has. When we trust ourselves, what we get is what weak and frail people do. And we'll see that as we go through the story. Sometimes they trusted God, sometimes they trusted themselves. Sometimes they got what God has, sometimes they got what weak and frail people get. But that brings us to verse 24 as we look at one thing a man of faith does is that he recognizes the temporary satisfaction of sin. By faith, Moses, when he had come of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. History Channel, I was watching a documentary, so-called, on the History Channel several years ago, and they were talking about the total debauchery of the Egyptian Empire. I mean, we think that today with the same-sex marriage and the gender identification and all of that sort of stuff, we think of how much our society, our culture is tubing by the moment. But we're pretty pristine compared to the Egyptians. I mean, same-sex marriage was no big deal to them. They married their brothers and sisters. There wasn't even I was reading this morning, there wasn't a concept in the Egyptian culture of morality. It just wasn't part of the equation. And we can read some of the Egyptian hieroglyphics, and they're nothing short of being pornographic. There was no morality in the Egyptian religion or in the Egyptian culture. And Moses had been under the influence of Jochebed, his mother. Remember when Miriam went to Pharaoh's daughter and says, I know I can get you a wet nurse. I know we can get somebody that can nanny him until he's weaned, which would have been until he was about 5 or 6 years old. And he was under his mom's influence during that time period. From the time that he was 5 or 6 years old on until his adulthood, he was raised by the Egyptian priest. He was taught in the Egyptian culture and religion. He was raised to be an Egyptian. I mean, he walked this way. He was in every sense of the word an Egyptian. But when the time came, he saw that everything that Egypt had to offer, all that the world had to offer, all the satisfaction that the world brings, is nothing compared to being in the center of God's will. Many of us have heard that oft-repeated story about how the natives in the frozen tundra of the north will take a knife, like a large hunting knife, and they'll allow layers of animal blood they'll dip it in animal blood and let it freeze, and then dip it again, let it freeze until it gets a big, thick, it just turns into a big old blood wolf sickle. And they'll bury it down in the dirt and let it freeze in the ice. They wait for the wolf to come along. He'll start licking the blood. I'm just having a good old time until he gets to the part where he licks off the blood, all the blood off of it. By that time, his tongue is frozen from licking the ice, and he doesn't know that his own tongue has been cut by the blade. And he continues to lick the blade. He's enjoying his own blood until he finally bleeds to death. And a lot of people use that as a story about how sin satisfies for a season, but it eventually kills. The problem with the story is not true. I mean, it appears as though it was actually an urban myth that was started, I guess, sometime, I guess you'd call it a wilderness myth, not an urban myth, but it was started sometime, I believe they traced it down to starting on the internet back around 1880 is where it first came from. But while it may not be true, boy, it sure is a good picture of it, isn't it? Of how sin satisfies for a time. It has this promise of fulfillment. I remember one of the most popular cigarette commercials, believe it or not, there used to be cigarette commercials. And I remember one of the most popular cigarette commercials when I was a kid growing up was having this guy, very sophisticated guy, take a big old puff off a cigarette and say, "It's so satisfying." And that was their whole ad campaign about how satisfying the cigarette was. Well, it was so satisfying, how come they had to smoke another one 15 minutes later? You know, it does satisfy for a moment or for 15 minutes for a season, but ultimately it lets you down. You know, well, probably this falls into the, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's too important not to pass on to everyone in my contacts list, shape of things. It does, I think, very much describe sin. Faith always brings the reward. Sometimes it's not immediately, though. But it's always ultimately. Moses wasn't going to receive the reward immediately by leaving the passing pleasures of Egypt behind and joining the trials and tribulations of walking around with his people for a generation, but it did ultimately provide fulfillment. By faith, he forsook Egypt, verse 27, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. And by faith, they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Now, if you've been with us since the beginning of our study, when we first started in the book of Hebrews, you remember back in chapters 3 and 4, where it talked about the people that they wouldn't believe God, they didn't trust God, they wouldn't have faith in God, and so he refused to allow them to enter into his rest. Remember that? He spent almost 2 chapters talking about that in Hebrews 3 and 4. Well, the they that we just read about here in verse 29 are the same they as back then in Hebrews 3 and 4. The same ones who wouldn't trust God to say, I'm going to deliver you, I'm going to take care of you, I'm going to lead you to the promised land. As soon as they got across the Dead Sea, they said, he brought us out here in the desert to die. Those aren't the most faith-filled words. And yet it's the same ones, same people who it says by faith they crossed through the Red Sea. You know, the same ones that of Hebrews 3 and 4 who by their unfaithfulness were prevented from entering the promised land. And we can say, how did they get in? I see how they got in chapters 3 and 4, but how did they get in chapter 11? Well, you know, it's kind of like, I mean, whenever you're standing in front of, it does take some faith to walk out into an ocean that's just been separated on each side, and you see the waters being piled up on each side, and then your leader saying, come on, follow me. And it does take some faith because you can't even see the other end of it. And you're going to be walking just not knowing if those waters are going to come back in any second. That takes some faith. I'll give them that. In fact, the word drowned that our author uses here is the word katapino. It occurs 7 times in the New Testament. 5 of the times that it occurs, it's translated either swallow or swallowed up. One time it's translated by devour it in 1 Peter chapter 5, where it says the devil's looking around seeing whom he can scarf up, whom he can devour. That's the word katapino. And only one time here in our text is it used, translated by the word drowned, which is adequate considering they were talking about the ocean. But it's like what actually happened was the Red Sea devoured the Egyptians. It gobbled them up. And by faith, verse 30, the walls of Jericho fell down after they were encircled for 7 days. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with them who did not believe, after she received the spies with peace. Well, again, the History Channel comes to our rescue. And it explains to us, I was watching, this has been a few years ago, but I was watching this History Channel on the Israelites becoming a nation. And they were talking about this ragtag bunch of nomads that were wandering around in the desert, but once they got like a bunch of people, they just decided nobody could stop them. And so they described the whole Battle of Jericho. And actually, the marching around Jericho for 7 days, that wasn't an instruction from God, according to the History Channel. It was actually a very brilliant military strategy. Because as the Israelites were marching around the city for 7 days, that was a diversion to all of the Jerichoites. All of the Jerichoites stopped what they were doing and got up on the wall to watch the Israelites as they marched around. And while all that was happening, the Israelite army was infiltrating the city. They were sneaking in unforeseen. And when Rahab laid that, hung that red scarlet thread out her window, her house was on the wall, so she hung it out the window. What she was doing was showing the Israelite army the secret entrance into the city while everybody else was being distracted. And then the yell, it says, then 7 days after they walked around the seventh day, then God says everybody to yell. And I've seen liberal commentators say, well, they created like a sonic boom by all this hundreds of thousands of millions of people that were yelling at the same time. And so the liberal commentators say it created a sonic boom. No, the History Channel says. All that was a signal to the guys that were already inside the city. That was a signal to them for them to attack. That's the way the world sees what happens. But what the Bible tells us is that by faith, they did all of these things, which were not very strong, sound military strategies. And they did all these things, and by faith, not only was the city turned over to them, but by faith, Rahab, when she acted by taking in these two spies, her and her family were spared. And she was no fool. She said to the two spies when they came in, they said, what's going on with you guys is no news. I mean, we've been following the daily news about what's been happening with you for the last 40 years. We've seen how God has provided for you and how you had manna coming from heaven and how your shoes never wore out and you never had any diseases or anything like that. We've seen how whenever any enemy chose to try to stand in your way, they were completely obliterated by you guys. We've seen that, and everybody in this city is scared to death of you. I'd like to, if you could just some way show me, I'd like to be one of you guys. I'd like to join the club. I'd like to be an Israelite. She was no fool. She had seen the evidence. She had looked at all the evidence, and she made a very reasoned response to that. And today we have all this evidence. It seems like I've been bombarded lately by people. Either it was people coming into my office I shared about last week, or people on the internet wanting somehow demanding a proof for God. As we saw last week, without faith, it's impossible to please Him. And if anybody wants to come to Him, they must first believe that He is. He shows us the evidence. We've got all that we need. Just like Rahab, she had all she needed to believe. But that belief required faith to take steps that resulted in her salvation. She was no fool. She looked at the evidence and made a very reasoned faith decision. I hope there are no fools here today. Or I hope if anybody is watching on the web cast, or anybody that someday would be looking at the archives or listening to it on the internet or anything like that, I hope if there are any fools that are listening to this message at any time in the future, you would do what Rahab did and you would respond to the evidence. And that brings us to verse 32 with the last one, number 7, and man of faith doesn't give up. The author continues, well, what more shall I say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, and also of David and Samuel and the prophets. For time would tell me. Now this is called the Hebrews Hall of Faith. And then he says, for time would fail to tell me of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah. I have to ask myself, is the author of the Hebrews, does he have the same book of Judges that I have? I mean, if you go back and read these stories in the book of Judges, this would be the last chapter you would talk about a man in the New Testament. I mean, it would be more accurate to say, by the flesh, Gideon took the gold from his share of the plunder and then turned it into an idol, which is what Judges chapter 8, verses 22 to 27 tell us. Or a more accurate way of studying it would be, by the flesh, Barak was afraid to go fight the Canaanites unless Deborah went with him. I won't go unless you go with me. Doesn't sound real faithful to me. We read about that in Judges chapter 4. By the flesh, Samson. Fill in the blank. By the flesh, Samson. Judges 14 through 16. 2 whole chapters are given to us about all of his fleshly escapades. By the flesh, Jephthah made a very rash vow concerning his daughters, or a daughter. We read about it in Judges chapter 11. By flesh, Abraham told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister. And then again, he said it to Abimelech. By the flesh, Jacob deceived his father concerning the blessing, Genesis 27. Even by the flesh, Moses struck the rock instead of speaking to it in Numbers 20, verses 10 to 11. How can these things be? How is it that the author can look at these events using the same book of Judges that we have, looking at the same book of Numbers and the same book of Genesis, they got the same Old Testament that you and I have. How can he come to those conclusions? Well, here's what I think it is. The Old Testament stories are given to us like they're played out in real time. When we read about all these characters in the Old Testament, all of Noah, Jonah, Sarah, Abraham, all of the cats in the Old Testament, when we look at the stories in the Old Testament, they're giving this to us in real time, showing us man's perspective of it. However, whenever we see these same guys being mentioned in the New Testament, remember what Peter said, by faith, he talked about the righteous Lot. And whenever the New Testament talks about these guys, they're looking at it from God's perspective. Old Testament looks at it from man's perspective. New Testament looks at it from God's perspective. Old Testament looks at it as man does it. New Testament looks at it after the cross has been applied. Another way of looking at it maybe would be like this. The redeemed people of God of all ages here and now, and by that I mean living here in the time-space continuum thingy, whether they were men that lived a generation, 2 generations, three generations ago, or should the Lord tarry, 30 generations in the future. But that's the way men look at the way people act. But once we enter the cross, once we apply the cross, then once we're there, not here on terra firma, but there in eternity, it's viewed at through God's perspective. The brass in the Old Testament was always a type of judgment. You had the brass, bronze serpent, and you had the bronze altar, and you had the bronze laver, and so forth. All of those things were symbols of brass. But then within the tabernacle, as we looked at repeatedly in our study of Hebrews, there were all these emblems of silver that speak of redemption. And from our vantage point, we see how the people of God that live down here on earth, they mess up and they fail and they try and then they lose and then they win and then they fail but then once we look at it through the lens of the cross, we see the beautiful silver of redemption. We've already seen it's not that God is interested in trying to have our good mojo outweigh our bad juju. It's not that. Don't get that idea. But for those who live by faith, our failures are eradicated by the victory of the cross. Whether they're past failures, whether they're present failures, or whether they're future failures, the cross takes care of that. And so it's not a matter of, we have to have that feather of truth, remember, from a few weeks ago of the Egyptian religion. We don't have that balance scale kind of relationship with God. But for those who live by faith, whether they are people that lived in the past or people that will come in the future, or whether it's our past or our future, the cross has already taken care of that. And God looks through the lens of what Jesus has already accomplished at the cross. And it is through his lens that he has the joy of seeing our acts of faith, because what would obliterate them or obscure them, if you will, by our failures have been eradicated by the cross, regardless of whatever dispensation we would live in, right? It says in verse 33, who through faith subdued mountains, worked righteousness and obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. Out of weakness were made strong and became valiant in battle, and turned to flight the armies of the alien. Now, as the author said up in verse 32, he says, time would fail me to go into detail of all these guys. And so now he's not even mentioning names anymore. You know, he's got to hurry up and finish up the chapter, or just like I got to hurry up and finish up the chapter. And so he's just speaking kind of in group speak. There were these guys that walked by faith, and they subdued kingdoms, and they worked righteousness, and quenched the violence of fire, probably talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They stopped the malice of lions, probably talking about Daniel when he was in the lion's den, and so on and so forth. Women received their dead raised to life again. Probably that widow of Zarephath who Elijah raised her son, probably thinking of that. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. You know, I had the pleasure of meeting a guy in China many years ago. He was a pastor he was one of the main leaders of the underground church movement of China. It was a long time ago. He spent 20 years in prison. He'd seen his wife die, all of his children. I think one of his sons was dead, and they were all grown. And he was an old man, pastored a church of 900 people in this little teeny tiny 3-story house, where they crammed in everybody they could get 3 times a week. And I can remember him telling me that the police kept coming around. They'd say, "We know what you're doing in here. You better stop it." And he said, "What are you going to do to me? Throw me back?" I mean, he'd spent 20 years in the coal mines. He was so proud because the only injury he'd received that whole time was when 2 coal cars slammed together and he got the side of his hand pinched. And he had this little teeny tiny hairline scar where his hand got pinched. He said most of the people get sentenced to maybe 3 or 4 years to the coal mines. They come out with missing fingers, missing hands, sometimes missing arms, because it's just such a dangerous place. But God had protected and preserved him in there. And then he said these police have been coming by, and they said, we know what you're doing, and you better stop it. And he said, I just looked at him, and I kind of giggled. I said, "What are you going to do to me? Throw me back in prison?" I mean, that's okay. If that's what you want, I'll preach to the people in prison. You want to kill me? You've already destroyed my family. I mean, what more can you do to me? And every time I read the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, I think of Pastor Samuel Lamb, and I think if the Bible were being written today, he would be one of those guys who were tortured and didn't accept the deliverance. Every year they would bring him before the commandant, the warden there at the prison, and want him to renounce his faith, renounce Jesus. They wouldn't do it. Sometimes faith sees the miracle. Sometimes by faith there's a miracle that's worked, where a mother receives her son risen back to life, or the mouth of a lion is stopped, or people thrown into fire aren't even burned. Sometimes faith sees the miracle. And sometimes faith sees the reproach of Christ. See, faith is not determined by the perceived outcome. Did you catch that? Faith is not determined by the perceived outcome. Doesn't even factor in to what faith is and what the faith walk is. Faith is trusting God regardless of the circumstances and regardless of the outcome. And he says others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. I mean, a better resurrection. Sometimes a mother receives her child brought back to life. I don't know that there's any grief on earth greater than a mother losing a child. Sometimes there's no greater grief than that. But faith recognizes that grief is only temporary. Maybe that mother does receive the child back, maybe the mother doesn't, but it doesn't factor into the issue of faith, because as the passing pleasures of sin, as the pleasures of sin are only temporary, so is the grief that associates faith that sometimes comes with it. Still others, verse 36, had trial of mockings and scourgings, yes, of chains and imprisonment. Something that's kind of interesting right here, I'd like to point out. In the Greek language, there are 2 words for the word all. In English we have all. All. There are two Greek words for the word others. I mean, not all, but others. One of them is the word for other is the word allos. And that's the word that's used up in verse 35, where it says that women received their dead back to life, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance. They were others of the same kind. That's what the word allos means. Those people were just like they were like you and me. They walked by faith, and they saw the reward of the faith. They were all of the same cut. But then in verse 36, it's the word heteros, which means they were another of a different kind. We have many English prefixes that begin with the word heteros. People of faith come in all kinds too. Some see the reward instantly. Some see the reward maybe a few weeks down the line or a few years down the line. Some people see the reward in the next life. And faith isn't colored by either one. People come in all kinds, and so does the reward of faith. Verse 37, they were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, were slain with the sword, they wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. It says they were tempted. What was the temptation that they received? To go get drunk and fornicate or something like that, or vote for the wrong political party. What was their temptation here? No, it was the temptation to not trust God. Just as the children of Israel that we read about back in chapter 3 and 4 were tempted to not trust God, and they succumbed to that temptation. And these guys were tempted in the same way, and they were slain by the sword as a result of it. Up in verse 34, well, it says that the stone, that's probably a reference to Zechariah. Not the Zechariah that wrote the book, but it was another Zechariah the prophet. He was the son of Jehoiada. And we read about him in 2 Chronicles chapter 24. And it was, he was one prophet that, he was a true prophet. And he stood firm on this prophecy that God had given. And there were a bunch of false prophets around who vilified him and ridiculed him and made fun of him. And the king didn't like the true prophet. He liked what the false prophets, because they said what he wanted to hear. And so as a result, Zechariah was stoned. Probably the last of the living prophets before all of Jerusalem, before the Babylonian invasion. Sawn in two is probably a reference to Isaiah. In the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Yavaot folio 49 is where it's at in the Talmud. It's kind of hard. You can look it up online. I did some researching this week and found it. But it says, Manasseh slew Isaiah, for he commanded, this is King Manasseh, really bad guy. He commanded that he should be slain with a wooden sword. And so they brought the saw, or wooden saw. They brought the saw and cut him in two. And when the saw reached his mouth, his soul fled from him. The rabbis taught that they didn't saw him in half like this away, but they sawed him in half from top to bottom, or bottom to top. And when it finally got up to his mouth, he died. His soul fled from him. And there's also a pseudepigraphal book called The Ascension of Isaiah. Not biblical. It's probably written about the 2nd or 3rd century AD. But they make reference to the same thing, probably from the same source as the Talmud. Others wandered around in sheepskins and goatskins. Of course, this would be some of the guys like Elijah. In verse 34, it says that they escaped the edge of the sword. In verse 35, it says they were slain by the edge of the sword. See, sometimes when we're standing by faith, we see a very evident deliverance because we stood by faith. We trusted God and He delivers us, and there's this, boy, Jesus, you came through right then. Sometimes it is. And sometimes when we stand by faith, we don't see the deliverance. Doesn't mean it's not going to come. It might come tomorrow. It might come next week. Or it might not come until we cross over. But faith trusts even when it can't see. And when there is an apparent lack of faith, or a lack of deliverance, it doesn't mean that there's a lack of conviction on my part. Am I doing something wrong? Lord, do I need to pray on the other need? Do I need to say things differently? Do I need to get into a different prayer closet or whatever? It's not a lack. Don't think that it's because you're doing something wrong. It's not a lack of compassion on God's part. Just because it's not coming through the way we think he should, it doesn't mean it's a lack of compassion on his part, nor is it a lack of control on his part. Faith is just the one that trusts God, with their eyes taken off the circumstances. And then he says in verse 38, of whom the world was not worthy. And they weren't. These guys, with all of their failures, with all of the ways in which we could say, how in the world did they get it in there? They're my heroes. This truly is the hall of faith of Christianity. I long to someday hang out with Barak and Samson and Jephthah. But, there were a lot of heroes that were this side of the Bible too, like Polycarp. When he was brought before the guys, and he was an old guy, and they said, Polycarp, just deny Jesus and you can live a ripe old age. You don't need to die this way, because he was such a well-respected man. And he said, I have served Christ 86 years and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king? I am a Christian. Guy's my hero. Many other of the church fathers that lived in the early centuries of the church persecution. I am awed when I read books like Fox's Book of Martyrs, or a more recent one by Voice of the Martyrs called Jesus Freak. I read some of the modern stories of how people stood by faith, and just the results of that standing it's awe-inspiring. These are my heroes. And Wycliffe and Luther and some of the other reformers. I think of Fanny Crosby, a famous hymn writer from the 19th century. One of the most prolific hymn writers of that era. She wrote hymns like Blessed Assurance, He hideth my soul, To God be the glory, many others. She was blind. She was blinded as an infant. She never remembered seeing. She was blinded by I think it was a medicine overdose or something. And she has no recollection of her sighted years. And she said, it seemed intended by the blessed providence of God that I should be blind all my life, and I thank him for the dispensation. If perfect earthly sight were offered me tomorrow, I would not accept it. I might not have sung hymns to the praise of God if I had been distracted by the beautiful and interesting things around me. Yeah, Fanny's one of my heroes of the faith. In fact, she said, if I had the choice, I would still choose to remain blind. For when I die, the first face I'll ever see will be the face of my blessed Savior. Many other persecuted Christians that are living in the world even today, they belong in this place, this Hebrews Hall of Faith. So do some of you. As I've watched and seen some of the things that you've encountered by faith, and just, oh yes, in your prayer closets you cried, and you had moments where you thought you were failing, and you thought you had taken your eyes off of God, but God's not looking at it from that perspective any more than he looked at it in those guys that we just read about. He's looking at the fruit of the cross. They wandered around in deserts and mountains and dens and caves of the earth. See, God doesn't focus on the failure. And as I've seen some of the ways some of you have encountered the worst that the world has to throw at you, and yet you still keep your eyes on him, I'm humbled and awed. All these, having obtained a good testimony through faith, did not receive the promise. And God, having provided something better for us, that they should not be made perfect apart from us. What this being made perfect. It means to arrive at the desired goal. Remember that? And he says these guys aren't going to arrive at the desired goal any quicker than we are. That's what the author is saying. Remember the feelings-o-meter of chapter 10? How we always have these, we look at the desired goal is to be perfect, but we feel like Dortvannet, and even on our best days, we feel like a loser or something like that. Well, what the writer of the Hebrews is wanting us to say is that it's no longer going to be a feelings-o-meter, it's going to be a reality-o-meter. We're not going to look at it by how we feel. We're going to look at it what's really true. Through Jesus, we have arrived at the desired goal, and that is perfect. And so all these feelings just are stripped away. They drop off and fade. And he says these people of the Old Testament that are mentioned here are not going to be arriving at the desired goal any more quickly than we are. Not talking about they're not going to heaven before us. It's not talking about that. It's saying that they're not going to experience the realities of the cross any quicker than anybody else does. And the reason why we have it better than them is because we have the manger. We can look back at the manger and we can see how God became a man. We have the cross. We have where Jesus lived and worked and spoke and taught and ministered and miracled and all of that as he was displaying the Father. As he told Philip, I've been with you so long and you still don't know that if you see me, you've seen the Father. And we have the cross. We have where the faithless, led by the devil, threw their worst at him. And as he was enduring the shame of the cross, even crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? We have that. We can look back. We don't have to look forward to it like the guys in the Old Testament did. They had, by faith, looked forward. By us, by faith, we look back to it. We have it. It's an historical fact. And we have the empty tomb. Death could not hold him. He rose from the dead, and we have that empty tomb today. And so the next verse, in chapter 12 of verse 1, therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Let's pray. God, we thank you for this book. We thank you for this chapter. We thank you for these people that it underscores. We thank you for the lessons that you, by your grace, you allow us to learn by the things that they endured. But Lord, most of all, we thank you for the victory that's in Jesus. That you don't see our failures. Oh, no, not if we put our eyes on Jesus. If we put our eyes on the author and finisher of our faith, you see not our failures, but our faithful victories. Thank you for that, Lord. Thank you for the assurance. And as a result of that, Lord, let us set aside those things that get in our way, things of this life that seem to cry out so loudly, and in reality have such a little impact, even on this life, but much less impact on eternity. Let us press on. Let us take that faith that you've imparted into us and let us walk on. Walk on with Jesus. And it's in whose name we pray. Amen. Let's stand.